In the pre-dawn darkness of January 30th, 1945, approximately 121 United States Army Rangers and two six-man Alamo scout teams lay flat in the tall, Kogon grass of Nueva Ecija province, Luzon, Philippines, less than 900 yards from a Japanese prisoner of war compound holding more than 500 emaciated American and Allied prisoners. The intelligence that had guided them to that exact position at that exact hour had not arrived through aerial photography, radio intercepts, or the formal intelligence apparatus of General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command. It had come from a network of Filipino civilians, including barrio officials who had publicly served Japanese-administered local governments for 3 consecutive years, who had spent months documenting guard rotations, fence construction, patrol timing, and off-site troop concentrations at personal risk to themselves and their families. With Japanese forces in disorganized retreat across Luzon and credible reports reaching MacArthur's G2 section, the Japanese garrison commanders were executing POW populations ahead of advancing American columns, as had already occurred at Palawan on December 14, 1944, where 139 American prisoners were burned alive. The 511 men inside the Cabanatuan compound were running out of time. By the morning of January 31, 1945, the intelligence provided by the Filipino Resistance Network would either be confirmed by a successful rescue or invalidated by catastrophe. This is the documented operational history of how Filipino civilians, including men publicly identified as cooperators with the Japanese occupation, built and sustained a human intelligence network that American military planners had systematically underestimated, and how that network made possible the most successful prisoner of war rescue operation in the history of the United States Army. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll, type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. When the Japanese Imperial Army completed its conquest of the Philippine archipelago in May 1942, American military planning for the eventual reconquest was already beginning to take shape in Australia, where General MacArthur had established his Southwest Pacific Area headquarters. Within that command structure, the G2 Intelligence Section, initially under Brigadier General Charles Willoughby, faced an immediate and persistent problem: how to obtain reliable tactical intelligence from a territory now under Japanese military administration, separated from the nearest Allied base by thousands of miles of ocean. The theoretical answer was the Filipino guerrilla resistance. From the earliest weeks of the occupation, organized resistance networks had emerged across Luzon, the Visayas, and Mindanao, drawing on elements of the former Philippine Army, the Philippine Scouts, and the Constabulary, supplemented by American officers who had evaded capture and gone into the hills. By 1943, MacArthur's headquarters was in submarine contact with several of these networks, including Colonel Wendell Fertig's organization in Mindanao, Colonel Russell Volkman's North Luzon guerrillas, and Colonel Macario Peralta's Panay network. The potential intelligence value was enormous. The institutional resistance to fully trusting this potential, however, was significant and well documented. American operational planners within CEFWPA harbored persistent concerns about the reliability of Filipino-sourced intelligence. The central fear was infiltration. The Japanese Kempeitai, military secret police, were known to be active across the occupied territory, and there was a documented history of counterintelligence penetrations in which resistance couriers and informants had been identified, turned, or replaced with Japanese-controlled assets feeding disinformation. Willoughby's staff, as documented in post-war analyses, exercised considerable skepticism toward intelligence that arrived exclusively to Filipino civilian channels without corroboration from Allied technical means. This skepticism had a specific dimension that shaped everything that followed: the question of collaborators. The Japanese occupation had produced a class of Filipinos who worked within the apparatus of the occupying government as barrio captains, municipal officials, administrative clerks, laborers at Japanese military facilities, and employees of Japanese-sponsored civil organizations. From the perspective of MacArthur's intelligence staff, these individuals were formally compromised. They had been seen to cooperate with the enemy. Their utility as intelligence sources was judged to be limited by precisely the fact that the Japanese trusted them, which meant in the dominant American analytical framework that they were either Japanese-controlled or too exposed to risk operational contact. This assessment was not entirely unreasonable. Some Filipino collaborators were genuine Japanese sympathizers. Some had been coerced and were deeply reluctant participants. Some were opportunists extracting personal advantage from the occupation. And some, A number that proved far larger than American planners assumed were deliberate penetrations, men and women who had accepted positions in the Japanese administrative apparatus specifically to gather intelligence for the resistance at constant personal risk with no guarantee of survival. The American military's categorical suspicion of the Collaborator class failed to distinguish between these groups. It treated an entire category of human intelligence source as inherently compromised. That analytical failure would have consequences, but not the ones planners feared. The consequences were that for much of the occupation, the intelligence flowing from the most deeply embedded Filipino assets was either discounted, delayed in its passage through official channels, or not solicited at all. To understand the specific operational situation that eventually forced American planners to depend on precisely the intelligence network they had been slow to trust, it is necessary to understand the condition of the Philippine prisoner of war population and the state of guerrilla organization in central Luzon by late 1944. The Cabanatuan POW camp, located near the town of Cabanatuan in Nueva Ecija province, was the largest American prisoner of war facility in the Philippines. It had been established in the summer of 1942 following the Bataan Death March, initially receiving survivors from Camp O'Donnell. At its peak, it had held more than 8,000 American and Filipino prisoners. Disease, starvation, brutality, and organized work details sent to labor at Japanese facilities throughout the Philippines had reduced that population drastically by 1944. By late January 1945, approximately 511 prisoners remained, a residual population left behind as the Japanese transferred healthier men to Japan aboard transport ships, many of which were sunk by American submarines without the Navy being informed they carried Allied POWs. The liberation of Leyte, beginning with MacArthur's return on October 20 of 1944 and the subsequent invasion of Luzon at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, fundamentally changed the strategic calculus around these prisoners. As the 6th Army under General Walter Kruger drove south toward Manila from Lingayen, Japanese forces fell back in increasing disorder. It was in this context that the massacre at Palawan became known. On December 14, 1944, Japanese guards at the Puerto Princesa POW camp on Palawan Island had herded 139 American prisoners into air raid shelters, doused them with gasoline, and set them on fire. A small number of men escaped over the cliffs into the sea and eventually reached Filipino guerrillas. Their accounts reached MacArthur's headquarters and immediately elevated the Cabanatuan situation from a humanitarian concern to an operational emergency. MacArthur's G2 section now needed precise, real-time intelligence about the camp. Not the broad survey data that had been trickling through guerrilla channels for months, but specific, actionable information about guard strength, perimeter construction, enemy force concentrations within striking distance, road conditions, and the timing of any prisoner movement or potential execution order. The problem was that the camp at Cabanatuan lay well beyond the front lines of the American advance. The 6th Ranger Battalion, recently formed and attached to the 6th Army, was identified as capable of conducting a deep raid. Its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci, was ordered to plan and execute the rescue. But Mucci's Rangers could not conduct a raid on intelligence they did not have, and the formal intelligence apparatus, aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts, could tell them frustratingly little about the specific tactical details that would determine whether 511 men came home or died in the attempt. The answer was already waiting. It had been waiting for 3 years. It was in Nueva Ecija, organized and operating, maintained at enormous personal cost by men who occupied precisely the ambiguous social position that American intelligence had been reluctant to trust. The formal intelligence request that went to the guerrilla networks of Nueva Ecija in January 1945 came under acute time pressure. The 6th Army's advance was accelerating. Each day that passed without a rescue attempt was a day closer to whatever date the Japanese garrison commander at Cabanatuan might receive or decide to act on in order to eliminate the prisoner population. The guerrilla commanders in Nueva Ecija were Captain Juan Pajoda, commanding the roughly 80-man guerrilla squadron 201 operating in the Cabanatuan area, and Captain Eduardo Yilson, commanding a separate force of approximately 90 guerrillas in adjacent territory. Both officers had been conducting sustained resistance operations in Nueva Ecija for years. Both had intelligence networks embedded in the civilian population of the province, and both had known for years that the prisoners at Cabanatuan were there, had monitored the camp's operations when possible, and had occasionally received intelligence from Filipinos working inside or near the facility. What the Alamo Scouts, Lieutenant Thomas Ronceville's team and Lieutenant William Nellist's team brought to that intelligence relationship when they infiltrated the Cabanatuan area on January 28, 1945, was the specific tactical framework for translating civilian observation into military-grade targeting data. The Scouts needed exact numbers. They needed confirmed guard positions. They needed to know what was beyond the camp perimeter, specifically, whether the Hongo Battalion, a Japanese force of approximately 800 soldiers documented to be moving through the province, would pass near the camp during the planned raid window. The scouts' work over January 28 and 29 produced critically important direct observation, but what the scouts observed directly was supplemented, verified, and extended by information that Pajota's civilian network had been accumulating for weeks and months. Among those sources were Filipinos who had worked in capacities that gave them access to Japanese military movements and the camp's administrative patterns. Individuals who had, from the outside, appeared to be part of the occupation's civilian infrastructure. The documented problem was timing. The Hongo Battalion's route of march brought it along the main road past the Cabanatuan area at a time that intersected with the planned raid window. A moving column of 800 Japanese soldiers within a few miles of the camp during a raid by 121 Rangers and a few hundred guerrillas would be catastrophic. The intelligence about the Hongo Battalion's exact disposition, its expected arrival time at the road junction near the camp, and its intended bivouac came in substantial part from the civilian network operating in the towns along its route of march. Without that specific intelligence, the raid could not be planned to account for the threat. Without accounting for that threat, the entire operation was likely to fail. The Alamo Scouts, working alongside Pajota's guerrilla network, assembled the full intelligence picture over the final 48 hours before the raid. What emerged was actionable targeting data of a quality that the American intelligence apparatus had been slow to believe a Filipino civilian network could produce. The adaptation that enabled the Cabanatuan raid was not primarily technological or doctrinal in the formal military sense. It was an intelligence doctrine adaptation, a shift under operational pressure from the institutional skepticism of Filipino civilian intelligence sources toward a structured integration of those sources into American tactical planning. Understanding how Pajota's intelligence network actually functioned requires understanding the three-tiered structure it had developed over years of occupation. The first tier consisted of the guerrilla force itself, armed men who conducted direct observation when possible. The second tier consisted of civilians openly sympathetic to the resistance, farmers, market traders, and rural residents who could move through the countryside without attracting undue Japanese attention and who passed oral reports through established courier chains to Pajota's command. The third tier, the most sensitive and the most valuable, consisted of individuals who held positions within the Japanese-administered civil structure of Nueva Ecija. These were barrio captains, clerks in municipal offices, laborers at Japanese facilities, and local men employed in various service capacities by the occupation administration. These individuals occupied a position of extraordinary danger and deliberate ambiguity. To the Japanese administration, they were cooperative locals, useful, trusted to a degree, and kept in their positions precisely because they performed their assigned functions adequately. To the resistance, they were inserted intelligence assets. The transition for many of them had not been voluntary in any simple sense. The Japanese occupation had conscripted local administrative structures into its governance apparatus, and many barrio captains found themselves serving the occupation whether they wished to or not. The decision some of them made to use that enforced cooperation as an intelligence opportunity was personal, undocumented in formal terms, and operationally irreversible once made. What these individuals could observe was qualitatively different from what any guerrilla or outside civilian could access. A barrio captain whose administrative jurisdiction included roads along which Japanese units traveled was in a position to report troop movements, vehicle types, supply loads, and direction of march with a precision that external observation could not match. A Filipino employed at a Japanese supply facility had access to inventory patterns, requisition records, and logistical flows that indicated operational planning. A laborer at the periphery of a Japanese military installation could observe guard schedules, entrance procedures, and internal organization in ways that external surveillance could not. For the Cabanatuan operation specifically, the intelligence flowing from this network included documentation of guard strength at the camp, estimated at approximately 73 to 80 guards on the night of the raid, a figure consistent with the Alamo Scouts' direct observation, as well as the configuration of the prisoner barracks, the location of Japanese guard towers, the position of the main gate, the internal road network within the compound, and the presence of light vehicles. Perhaps most critically, intelligence from civilian sources embedded in the towns along the Hongo Battalion's route of march provided information about that unit's composition and movement schedule that allowed Pajota to plan the blocking operation at the Cebu River Bridge, the tactical element that would keep 800 Japanese soldiers from reinforcing the camp while the Rangers executed the raid. The adaptation at the command level was facilitated by the direct working relationship between the Alamo Scouts and Pajota's guerrillas in the field. Rounceville and Nellis teams did not arrive as skeptics dismissing Filipino intelligence. They arrived as professional operators who needed information that only the local network could provide, and they worked with Pahota's structure to extract, verify, and format that information for transmission to Mucci. What the scouts provided was the validation layer, direct observation that could confirm or challenge what the civilian network reported, and a conduit back to the Ranger command that framed the civilian intelligence in terms that American military planning could act on. At the Ranger command level, Lieutenant Colonel Mucci accepted the intelligence picture assembled through this combined process. The plan that emerged from it assigned Pajota's guerrillas the critical task of blocking any reinforcement from the east, specifically from the direction of the Hongo Battalion at the Kabu River Bridge, using a bazooka team and all available guerrilla fire. Yosan's force would block the western road. The Rangers would conduct the assault on the compound itself. The entire plan depended on the accuracy of the intelligence about the Hongo Battalion's timing and the camp's guard strength. Both pieces of intelligence had come, at least in substantial part, from the civilian network that American doctrine had been slow to trust. At approximately 7:30 p.m. on January 30, 1945, the 6th Ranger Battalion's assault force crossed the line of departure from its staging area in the barangay of Platero, moving south toward the Cabanatuan POW camp in a long column through flat agricultural terrain. The distance was approximately 25 miles from the nearest American lines, and the column had been moving since dawn, guided by Filipino civilians through territory that required careful navigation to avoid Japanese patrols and observation posts. The column moved in near total silence. At the same time, the two Alamo scout teams, Roundsavilles and Nellists, were already in position ahead of the main body, having maintained observation of the camp through the previous 2 days. Their final intelligence confirmation, transmitted back to Mucci, indicated that the guard roster at the camp appeared unchanged. The Hongo Battalion, according to the most recent intelligence from Pajota's network, was still to the east, moving along its anticipated route, not yet at the Kabu River crossing. The timing envelope for the raid appeared to be intact. Pajota's force of approximately 80 guerrillas moved independently to the Kabu River Bridge. Joson's force took up its blocking position to the west of the camp. Both forces were in position by approximately 7:10 p.m. Pajota's men carried a bazooka, the weapon that would be the only thing standing between 800 Japanese soldiers and the assault force during the raid, along with whatever small arms the guerrilla force had accumulated over years of operations in Nueva Ecija. The guerrillas had no artillery support, no air cover, no radio link to American forces that would result in any reinforcement if the Hongo Battalion arrived early or in greater strength than anticipated. The Rangers' assault element, Company C under Captain Robert Prince, was the primary striking force. Prince's plan divided his force into teams assigned to specific objectives within the compound: the main gate, the Japanese officers' quarters, the guard barracks, and the prisoner barracks themselves. The raid was designed to be over in approximately 30 minutes. Every minute beyond that increased the risk that the Hongo Battalion would reach the camp before the prisoners could be moved. At 7:44 p.m., a P-61 Black Widow night fighter aircraft from the Army Air Forces, whose appearance had been coordinated to serve as a diversion, began making low passes over the camp. The aircraft's engine noise and the attention it drew from the Japanese guards created a window of distraction. The Alamo scouts, forward of the main body, signaled that the time was right. At approximately 7:45 p.m., a Ranger opened fire on the guard tower at the main gate. Within seconds, the entire assault force was moving. The Rangers breached the outer perimeter and moved toward their assigned objectives simultaneously, the concentrated violence of the attack designed to neutralize the garrison before any coordinated Japanese resistance could form. The Japanese guard force, whose strength had been estimated at 73 to 80 men by the combined intelligence effort, a figure that proved accurate, was caught in a compound-wide engagement from which there was no effective defense. The prisoner barracks presented an immediate and critical problem. The American and Allied prisoners inside, weakened by years of malnutrition and disease, many barely able to walk, had not been informed in advance that a rescue was coming. The sudden eruption of gunfire inside their compound, in the darkness, generated understandable panic. Many prisoners initially took cover, uncertain whether the attack was Japanese or Allied. Rangers who reached the barracks shouted identification and ordered the prisoners to move toward the main gate. Some prisoners required physical assistance. Some were so weakened that they had to be carried. Rangers who had been briefed on the physical condition of the prisoners began the work of moving more than 500 men toward the gate and the waiting vehicles and litters outside. At the Kabu River Bridge, approximately 800 yards from the camp, Pajota's guerrillas heard the gunfire begin and stood to their positions. The Hongo Battalion was approaching. The first contact between Pajota's blocking force and Japanese advance elements occurred within minutes of the raid's opening. The guerrilla force, dramatically outnumbered, held the bridge against the Japanese column's initial attempts to advance, using the bazooka to disable lead vehicles and direct fire to create a choke point. The engagement at the Kabu River Bridge continued for the entire duration of the prisoner evacuation. Documents from the 6th Ranger Battalion's after-action report, filed in the days following the operation and subsequently held in United States military archives, record that the assault inside the compound was essentially complete within approximately 30 minutes of its initiation. The Japanese garrison was destroyed. The prisoner evacuation, however, took longer than the assault. The physical condition of the men inside the compound meant that moving them to the rally point required sustained effort under fire. The column of rescued prisoners, rangers, scouts, and guerrillas began moving north away from the camp, with the sound of Pajota's engagement at the Kabu River Bridge continuing behind them. Filipino civilians from the surrounding barrios, alerted by the guerrilla network in advance of the raid, were present along the evacuation route with carabao-drawn carts to transport prisoners who could not walk. This prepositioning of civilian evacuation assets was itself a product of the intelligence network's organizational reach. Pajota's civilian contacts had been notified of what was coming and had prepared the necessary support without any direct American command involvement. The column reached the town of Balincaran by approximately midnight. American Army vehicles sent forward from the nearest lines met the column there and began transporting prisoners to field hospitals. The march and vehicle transit continued through the night. By early morning of January 31, 1945, the evacuation was complete. The after-action report documented 511 prisoners rescued. American casualties in the assault force were 2 Rangers killed and 11 wounded. Japanese casualties inside the compound were documented at approximately 523 killed. At the Kabu River Bridge, Pajota's guerrilla force had held the Hongo Battalion's advance for the full duration of the operation without being overrun, a tactical achievement that, given the force disparity, depended entirely on the preparation, discipline, and detailed knowledge of local terrain that Pajota's years of resistance operations had developed. The intelligence picture that had made all of this possible, the accurate guard count, the Hongo Battalion's timing, the route of march, the internal layout of the compound, had come through a collection process that depended critically on men and women who had spent 3 years in the morally complex and physically dangerous position of appearing to serve the Japanese occupation while secretly serving the resistance. The reaction within MacArthur's headquarters to the Cabanatuan raid was immediate and documented. MacArthur issued a public statement praising the operation as an example of coordinated Allied military action. The 6th Ranger Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation. Individual decorations were awarded to Muchi, Prince, and others within the American Assault Force. The contribution of Pajota's and Joseon's guerrilla forces, and through them the civilian intelligence network that had made accurate planning possible, received formal recognition in after-action documentation. Pajota and Joseon were recommended for American military decorations, and both subsequently received recognition from the United States Army. The after-action report filed by Lieutenant Colonel Nucci explicitly credited the Filipino guerrilla forces with the blocking operations that protected the evacuation and acknowledged the intelligence support provided by the local civilian network. Within the intelligence analysis community of SWPA, the operation's success contributed to an ongoing reassessment of Filipino civilian intelligence sources that had been underway since the Leyte landing. Willoughby's section had by this period developed more structured relationships with the major guerrilla networks and was receiving a higher volume of civilian-sourced intelligence, including material from individuals embedded in the Japanese administrative apparatus, than had been the case in 1942 or 1943. The Cabanatuan raid provided a specific and dramatic validation of that intelligence stream. The Japanese response to the raid was operationally limited. The Manila garrison, already under pressure from the American advance, could not conduct a meaningful counter-operation in Nueva Ecija. The Hongo Battalion, delayed by Pajota's blocking force at the Kabu River, did not reach the camp in time to affect the outcome and subsequently disengaged without attempting a sustained pursuit. Japanese records captured following the fall of Manila indicate that the loss of the camp garrison was documented, but did not prompt a broader revision of Japanese prisoner management doctrine, which was already disintegrating along with a broader defense of Luzon. The fate of the men and women in Pajota's civilian intelligence network after the liberation of the Philippines is not uniformly documented in available historical records. Some continued to work with American forces during the final months of the Luzon campaign. The broader question of how Filipino collaborators, including those who had genuinely served the resistance from within the occupation apparatus, were assessed and treated after liberation is complex and, in many cases, individually unresolved in the available record. The Cabanatuan raid has been extensively studied in the decades since 1945, most thoroughly in Hampton Side's 2001 narrative history, Ghost Soldiers, which drew on National Archives documents, after-action reports, and interviews with surviving participants. That research confirmed what the operational record already indicated. The raid's success was a collective achievement in which the Filipino guerrilla and civilian intelligence network was not merely supporting but structurally enabling. The broader lesson, the one that was slow to be absorbed in 1942 and 1942, was that human intelligence from civilian populations living under enemy occupation, including individuals who had accepted positions within occupation administrative structures, could be of decisive tactical value when properly organized, handled, and integrated with direct observation. The category of the collaborator, applied as a blanket disqualification, failed to account for the reality that some of the most valuable intelligence sources available to Allied forces in the Pacific were men and women who had made the calculated and dangerous choice to appear cooperative while working actively against the occupying power. The Filipino civilians who fed information to the resistance at Cabanatuan were not, for the most part, celebrated in the immediate post-war period, with the visibility given to the Rangers who carried out the assault. Their contribution was embedded in unit citations, intelligence reports, and after-action documentation rather than in public narratives. The operational record, however, is unambiguous. Without their intelligence, the raid could not have been planned with the precision it required. Without the precision it required, the raid would have failed. 511 men came home because a network of Filipinos, some of them holding positions that made them look, to casual observation, like servants of the enemy, had spent 3 years doing exactly the opposite. The doctrine was changed not by argument but by proof. The proof was delivered on the morning of January 31st, 1945, when the trucks carrying the survivors of Cabanatuan reached the American lines.